Welcome to This Week in Coworking, where industry leaders get succinct, actionable insights. Here are your hosts, Hector Kolonas and Mike LaRosa.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to the This Week in Coworking podcast feed. Once again, I am Hector Kolonas, and I'm joined by my amazing co-host, Mike LaRosa. Mike, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. We got through another week, surviving summer storms here in Florida. It's that season, but I'm glad to be back in home base and podcasting with you. Chock full newsletter this week. There's a ton for us to dive in to. Oh, we won't be able to get to everything, but I'm looking forward on touching a couple hot topics that we've seen bubble up, and a lot of love for our friends down under, which is possibly a coincidence with all of our focus on unpacking APAC, but it is exciting to have a lot of stories come up from Australia, and it's given me an itch to go down there. It's been a little too long. It's been 10 years.
I think you're absolutely right. So if anyone from the Australian subscriber base wants us to come over, let us know. Let's arrange a tweak on the road, and we'll take a short flight over to Australia to do some podcasts there. But as you said, there's a lot in the newsletter this week. We're going to touch on around 4-ish topics in this episode. So if you're listening in, you're going to hear us talk about the big conversation around disintermediation that's happening across the co-working world right now. We're going to look at 2 amazing stories around WOTSO and what they're doing and what it means for all of us. We're going to look at some recession-proofing concepts and conversations that are happening, and then staying in Australia for a little bit more, as you said, looking at some of the data out of one of the big aggregators on that side, just looking at what it means in relation to that market. This episode of the newsletter and the podcast are brought to us by the Unpacking APAC mini-series, which is one of the shows on our podcast feed. So if wherever you're listening to this or watching this, go back to the feed and look for those 2 episodes. 2 out of the 6 episodes of the mini-series are now out. First one, looking how asset managers are changing their strategies and adopting more flex practices. And the second, a veteran hotelier and hostel leader digging into kind of what he's seen and learned around hospitality and how that can be adapted into kind of flex and co-working and commercial real estate. So then that's Gadi Hassin, previously the director of Selena worldwide. So definitely go and listen to both those episodes. But let's address the elephant in the room. Mike, we saw 2 completely polar opposites, I guess, opinions around this disintermediation topic. Which one do you want to start with?
Well, I think let's just dive into the overall discussion, and then we can probably touch on those 2 different viewpoints. One of that being from a legacy flex broker, one of the first or self-named first flex broker in the industry dating back to the early 90s. And then we've also got commentary from an operator. So for those of you that might have missed the discussion, there was what I would believe is maybe like an offhand comment made on a panel about operators disintermediating themselves. That's a tongue twister. From brokers. And I think that a lot of times in the world that we live in, you see an 8 to 10 second clip online, or you read a post that's summarizing someone else's opinion of what happened. Neither you and I were in that room, so it's hard to put it into context, but the general gist was operators should possibly consider disintermediating themselves from brokers. But I think that there's a lot of nuance there, so I'm glad that we're taking some time to talk about it. The first post was very defensive from the broker standpoint, saying brokers do a lot, they bring a lot of value. Quote that everyone's talking about included a quote from an operator that was like, brokers, what do they do, right? Why are we paying them this money? And so, of course, brokers are going to be very defensive. On the flip side, we have an operator that basically is saying the quiet part out loud. This is already happening, folks, in different ways, shapes, and forms. So how are you as an operator either leveraging that to your benefit, or like, how are you as an operator trying to diversify your business? And that touches on a side topic that we don't have time to get into today, but that is this industry becoming a commodity. And so in a commoditized industry, how do you stand out? And so Jeremy from Factory was basically saying, you need to make your own space stand out. And if you do that, then you don't really have to necessarily be reliant on brokers. I could ramble on. I don't know if you wanted to put in your 2 cents before I throw in any more, but I don't want to like just go on and on. I think there's a lot here to unpack. So now that I've framed it, Hector, I'd love to hear your take, and then you can wrap that up.
Yeah, just building on your framing a little bit. I know that we have a lot of listeners that may not have English as their first language. So what the F is disintermediation? It's basically just removing the brokers from the middle of transactions. They're saying the commentary is around whether we should remove brokers completely from the equation of filling co-working spaces. No one is really saying that on either side. I think most of the commentary is around how some transactions don't make financial sense in the current tech and operating landscape for brokers to fill. And brokers would disagree. I know many great brokers who are filling 1 to 3 person offices. They're placing individual people into co-working spaces and building that relationship for the long term, having turned a 3-person requirement into a 40-person requirement over a couple of years. That's a kind of forward-looking broker. Now, but not all brokers are like that. And it would be disingenuous to group all brokers online and offline into one category. But I do think we're seeing, like, underneath all of this, the undercurrent of this all is that there's 2 shifts happening. One, brokers have to become tech enabled. They need better data. They need to be able to do things more efficiently. They need to be able to turn around these requests more rapidly, more efficiently, not only for them, but for the operators as well. If they're making operators jump through 30 hoops and then also submit a PDF or a Excel sheet in a specific format, or they won't be included, then you're not making it efficient enough for anyone, that you lose the point of that whole transaction. Like that, the revenue just goes out the window. The operational profit of that revenue goes out the window. That's the one. The other is e-commerce is on a tear right now. If you know the brand and you like the brand and you've visited the space, or you've got a search engine or an AI engine that like Perplexity or whatever you're using to search the internet, and it's telling you where to go and book directly,
Yeah.
that's happening, right? That no operator is saying, we don't want you to go through the broker. We're just saying, hey, we've got a website, we've got e-commerce, we've got booking capabilities. And so these 2 shifts are like tugging at this broker part, but it is worth saying that there are these bigger deals, the multi-city deals, the Flex Plus, so traditional with spillover space. These are all being negotiated by some of the top tier flex brokers. And I think we have to really go back to what we talk about on this podcast way too much, and that's terminology. There is a brokers, commercial real estate brokers, and there's what like flex enabled or flex focused brokers who are understanding of the nuances of filling these spaces and those long tail leads, as opposed to just thinking in short term. So it's very interesting to see these 2 conversations spill out from the conference. As you said, we weren't in the room when the comments were made. We did have Will on a previous podcast for a weekly recap from Yardi, who shared their opinion on the whole story. But it's a really interesting one.
To take where you were saying, I think, we need to understand when you talk about terminology, that always leads me to the different varieties of inventory that are within this sub niche of a larger real estate industry. And I think that there is some type of inventory or some type of requirements or requests come from clients where the brokers would probably like to disintermediate themselves because it's not worth their time to try to hunt down maybe an offsite venue where the client only needs it for 2 days. And I'm not going to put myself in that person's shoes. And I don't want to take their words, but knowing what I know about the industry, the phrase that he said was probably more so about different types of scenarios. And I think that it just supports the argument that as an operator, you really need to have all of your channels fully up and running. You need to have great relationships with brokers for some of those larger, more corporate requirements. You might need to have a relationship with the local brokers on the ground that are working more with the local medium, small businesses. And then you need to make sure that you're plugged into the variety of different aggregators that are out there, specifically because of the boom in this e-commerce functionality or demand for that type of functionality. So I think that it's natural for people to get defensive. It's natural for people to take pause, but all in all, I don't believe that this company, Yardi, is specifically trying to cut brokers out. I think that they're just trying to, and this is why we in the newsletter included, they're trying to find a future for tech-enabled brokers
Mhm.
to help give brokers the technology they need, to your point, to more quickly turn that around. Because if there's anything that I've learned, and I've been on both sides of this table,
Yeah.
is that a flex deal, you're competing against the clock.
Mhm.
Like, really, someone comes to you, I need this space. When you're off there running, trying to pull those requirements, they're not sitting around waiting for
Yeah.
you to come back to them. They're continuing to find and to
Mhm.
search. And so if you are a broker that's leveraging technology to more quickly and more easily help your operator fulfill that
Yeah.
gathering process, then that's the win there. But the broker's still a part of the process.
Mhm. Absolutely. I always like to think of the travel agency model, right? There
Yeah.
was a time where you could only book through travel agencies. And I know that I grew up, my parents used to run a travel agency. I used to sit there and they used to swipe the credit card machine and print out this crazy loud ticket machine. And at some point, the OTAs came around and it removed
Yeah.
travel agencies from a lot of the transactions that could now be done DIY or through OTAs. But for premium, for corporate, for business travel, there's still a need for a travel agency. If you've ever tried to go somewhere where travel doesn't have the sort of abundance of OTA enabled services, you know how valuable that travel agent is, right? And so I think we're going to just see the shift in how
Yeah.
brokerages sell and fill flex. They're not going to be removed. I think we're just going to see them evolve. And as I said before, we weren't in this room, but I do sit in a lot of rooms with a lot of execs across our industry. And
Yeah.
the question around brokerages and brokerage strategies and aggregator strategies and how do they improve the margins per booking is something that's on everybody's mind, right? And it's a conversation that keeps coming up again and again,
Yeah.
even more so now where we're heading into choppier or uncertain waters. And I think that brings us to another story, right? We had Miro over at Office R&D put together a bunch of tips on how you can kind of recession-proof your co-working space. I think it's a timely piece, given that a lot of the conversations I'm having with leadership teams at my day job is around what is everyone doing? Is everyone kind of buckling down and tightening the hatches and getting ready for choppy waters? Is our CEOs shifting back to wartime CEO after the COVID times? Are we seeing our companies implementing kind of black swan products that kind of go up as the market goes down? And all these conversations are happening. So just a very timely piece. I know we don't like to bang the scary drum here about whether a recession is coming or not, but it is a conversation that is continuously happening. So we definitely want to just highlight that and be like, maybe you should just think about if things go really well, what happens? If things go badly, kind of what does that mean for you? What does that mean for your space? How can you support your community? Because I'm not sure who I was speaking to yesterday. They were like, the one thing they learned from COVID is to always prepare for the impossible, right? No one went into 2020 thinking, oh yeah, we should probably plan for a global pandemic that shuts down all offices. But after that, they were like, okay, what is the craziest thing that can happen? Let's at least pencil down a plan for if that happens, if our inventory system goes bankrupt, if our door access company disappears or gets acquired by a competitor, or all these things that we normally be like, yeah, it's an edge case. It's very unlikely to happen. We're seeing leadership starting to think, okay, yes, it's a very unlikely situation, but we should probably plan for it just in case. At least pencil down a plan, at least start thinking about the alternatives, the plans, the positioning, just in case any of these things happen.
Yep. I would be the last one to turn to for financial advice and whether or not we're heading for a technically defined recession. Because, of course, now
Mhm.
there's always debate whether or not you are in a recession based on what the
Yes.
government accepts as a number or whatnot. I think, though, if there's one thing I know for sure is that we are just entering more uncertain times.
Mhm.
And things are up and down, sideways, left and right, no matter what your political leaning is.
Yep.
I think we just have more uncertainty.
Yep.
And so, with that, my takeaway is if you are currently successful in considering an expansion, don't expand into additional leased locations, but take a look at all these various stories that we publish every single week
Mhm.
about management partnerships, opportunities to partner with REITs. And so that would be my takeaway, is that if I'm talking to an operator right now, you either buy the building, or you partner with the owner, you don't sign that lease. And then last but not least, little shout out, there was a cool celebration for a space down in Australia celebrating 7 years. And the husband-wife team also in that post acknowledged that they turned to, in economic uncertainty, to take a look at how their membership base was and that there was an economic reflection. So I think it's hard to say, are we in for a global recession? But I think that there's going to be different markets that are impacted differently. The DC market is most definitely absorbing some shock from losing a lot of contracts. There's other cities that might be tied to larger government spending or not. And so it would be interesting to see. Don't get too worried about the mega trend, but take a look what's happening in your own space. And also, if we want to be a little positive here, not so pessimistic, downturns economically tend to always be good for entrepreneurship, which directly can be good for co-working. And so how do you position your location as more than just a service of workspace, but a community? And we have another post this week that we were planning on talking about. I'll just reference to how do you engage with virtual members. So even if you have someone that says, I love this space, but I don't necessarily have the money for my private office still, just hold on to them and say, well, you can keep this address, you can lower your price, but you can still be part of that community and focus on the events you can host for that local community to get through whatever type of uncertain times that they're encountering.
Very well said, and two very good strategies, Mike, given that I think we've both been in the industry long enough to have gone through one of these dips. So
and we got the gray hair to show it, Hector.
As you can see,
I'm old, because this is the type of conversation when we first met service office OGs that talked about, oh, we made it through the .com bust, or we made it through the '08 recession back in the day when I was just flinging lattes at Starbucks back then. You know, it's kind of crazy that we've now been through the COVID and now this new kind of phase, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And you bring up a very valid point around the management agreements. If you have a strong brand and your unit economics makes sense, and you can tie your operating model and your tech stack in a bow and make it scalable, you're in the driver's seat, right? Buildings are empty. REITs are looking for partnerships. You can put in terms that have never been done before. If I remember just as you mentioned, after the .com bubble and during the Great Recession, some of the deals the operators made before that, they were unprecedented. They were unfathomable to get the concessions and the deal terms and the rev shares and the fit outs and the delayed rent payments that have all kind of now become commonplace. They all kicked off during downturns. Shift back to that kind of wartime CEO. Think about what moves do you need to make to shore up your business, and then now is the time to expand, right? If you're financially stable, right? We are not giving you financial advice. We are not qualified in any way to do this. Is more for education and entertainment use, but what I would be thinking about is what opportunities exist. We heard about Craig and the Creative Density last week, merging to shore up their offering and kind of build up their valuation. So we're seeing these moves being made. I just want to hit on one more thing before we move on, and that's another story from our data section this week, which kind of looked at some changes in kind of the Australian market. Just wanted to tie it to what we're speaking about now. Often we talk about recession, we think, oh, America, we have a global readership. I know this newsletter is somehow very Australian focused, but even there in the data that Rubberdesk shared, we're starting to see operators making shifts around their pricing, especially around their larger units. Although desk rates were a little bit up, 1.2% up at around 660 US Australian dollars per month, the actual demand is down a bit, and that's affecting them to change prices on different types of units. So that size office, 16 to 50 desk offices were kind of 6% higher, but the larger offices, 50 plus desks, were actually down around 16%. So you're seeing that shift of folks planning and bringing their prices down on the bigger offices, maybe giving more concessions, maybe trying to lock in longer term flex clients in there. So it's not purely a US thing. We're seeing operators around the world strategize around how they can shore up that their memberships and their utilization as the market is shifting and there is uncertainty everywhere.
This is a data point that it's always nice to include, and I always love absorbing as much data as possible. I would file this under like least surprising data point. I think that what we're observing is for every action, there's a reaction, and companies are starting to kind of land in this hybrid return to office program. And I think that the gold rush of 50 to 100 desk suites post-COVID is now we're starting to see a response, because I know operators that are splitting these suites up. People don't want to no one wants to be in a room with 50 people. Let's be honest. And so I think that we're just seeing a trend, but that's what's so great about Flex is that, especially if you go in with certain design principles, is that you build in the flexibility for you yourself, the operator, to adjust, not just for your members to adjust. So that's not a lot to throw in there, but I'm not really surprised. I see on demand increasing, another news story this week. The Mullen is this amazing space, like literally can't get into the one in Soho because it's so popular. Their newest location, which is, newsflash, a third location of part of a partnership with the building owners, it's more focused. They're shifting away into more event and meetings and more of this hybrid flex. So even they are shifting away from those offices. So I think the days of 3 floors of just nothing but aisle, those glass boxes, I think that's evolving.
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes back to what we're seeing around the world, right? When we spoke to Sophia last, they had to build an entire new center purely based on this event, on this day office, on this concierge, remote team building side of the industry, which they had to do, otherwise it would have gone somewhere else. So we're definitely seeing that shift. And going back to what you mentioned a bit earlier in a previous story, it goes back to the fact that our products are not static. It's not a hotel room that is a hotel room and will always be a hotel room. It could be a 50-person studio. It could be 3 12-person studios with a breakout space, right? There are much more permutations of our products, and that's what makes it so complicated to be on the selling side and filling side of this, right? You have to understand that nuance, that just because someone has a 50-person office, you don't have to sell it. You could sell it as to a media agency with 10 people that has a podcast studio, that has it's a private meeting room, and has a pool table. Like, there's so much you can do in a 50-person office, but you have to understand the flexibility of each operator so that you can fill that. So just going back and giving another tap to that broker benefit there. But it's not all doom and gloom. As you said, we did see a story that both of you and I got really excited about when we saw it come out this week. WOTSO, who've been in the newsletter a whole bunch of times, and Jesse was one of our first guests here on the podcast, they've actually rebranded, and it was a really interesting rebrand because it wasn't a change in a lot, except they dropped a word. Mike, what did that mean to you?
Yeah, so there's a lot of noise in this world, in social media and various news sites, and our newsletter included, right? There's always a lot of hot topics. But the thing that I come back to time and again, what I love the most about This Week in Coworking, is that sometimes we can flag a signal that helps kind of separate us up from the noise. And we were joking before we hit record, this could be a snoozer of a story that you just completely pass over. But really, I thought that this was the biggest story of the week. And so I'm so glad that we're talking about it. WOTSO changed their name from WOTSO Property to WOTSO. And so, to coin the phrase from the episode's title, "What's so in a name?" Like, why is this such a big deal, Mike and Hector? You might be wondering. Like, they just dropped property. First off, WOTSO has always been on our radar because they are publicly traded. And so this is one of the few publicly traded organizations in our industry. Because they're publicly traded, they have to publish their financials. So it's always really fascinating to see what is going on behind the scenes and in the inner workings. Secondly, WOTSO has really leaned into its roots of being a property investment trust where they own a portfolio of these buildings, but their strategy has been to really master the operations and hospitality of flexible space
Mm-hmm.
and incorporate that into repositioning the assets within the portfolio. And what really excited me was that their flex space division now has 31 sites and they're continuing to grow. They're adding them like we can't keep up with them. Like I said, they're in this newsletter all the time, but that they generated 15.8 million Australian dollars in revenue, which was double that of the traditional property component of the portfolio, totally valued at $265 million Australian. So this is like, when you're a publicly traded company, you don't do things lightly. And when you do a branding effort, you have to change everything. Now, even though they're just dropping property, there's still a lot of work that goes into there, revising the name, filing the paperwork, changing the logos, like the whole 9 yards. So this to me was the most exciting, most optimistic signal that yes, you can have a successful Flex-enabled portfolio strategy where you're using Flex no different than other REITs use hotels or food service or different types of like niches to to underpin their overall portfolio focus. And so this tells me, combined with CBRE's move to absorb and acquire Industrious, that I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing more of these REITs trying to, if not fully reposition themselves, most definitely embrace Flex as a larger component of how they present themselves to not only their customers, but to their stakeholders and their shareholders.
Absolutely. And it's a really interesting one because it's also the proof's finally in the pudding around this whole PropCo OpCo strategy. For a lot of folks, it was like a theoretical thing. You could have a company that owns, and then you in-house have a company that activates, runs, is responsible for building. And we have seen obviously some examples here in the US and elsewhere of this working really well. But as you said, this is 100% signal in the busy week of noise, right? If you are looking for one story to share with folks about whether co-working and flex is here to stay, this is a piece to look at. This is the numbers to share and really ingrain as you start working on those agreements. And as we said earlier, as you start planning your next moves and what comes next for you, this is signal, right? This is when you can go back and be like, here is quantifiable data and numbers that show that when done right, buildings that are maybe not always class A or prime buildings can be reactivated, can be revalued by bringing in a well-tuned and well-optimized flex offering. And just to add to that, they're also taking this revenue, that 15 plus million in revenue, and investing it into strategic, clever partnerships like the one with Bubba Desk, where they're bringing in more childcare into their spaces and creating these centers that enable more people who were locked out of flex to come in. And then you can only really do that if you are the owner, the operator, the revenue driver, to make those calls. And so big congrats to Jesse and the team at WOTSO on just pushing forward and taking this bold move, right, to really position flex as the center of WOTSO right now.
Yep, couldn't put it better. A lot of operators have attempted to incorporate childcare. It's not easy. It's a major lift. But with the success that WOTSO has had in repositioning this asset, I'm so excited that they're continuing this partnership, because if there's someone to figure out how to make it work, I really think it's this team.
Yep, absolutely. And we're going to keep an eye on that for sure. As Mike said, there is 13, 14 other pieces in this week's newsletter. Head over to thisweekincoworking.com, click on week 22. By the time this is out, that will be live. You'll be able to dive in and join the news. If you want your news summarized and delivered right into your inbox, drop your email into the box at the top of the site. It is free. Emails arrive at 6 a.m. every Thursday. And we will be here again next week talking about what's in next week's newsletter. So definitely hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below about what you thought of this week's newsletter. Mike, as always, an absolute pleasure. I will speak to you again next week.
See you then.